Hi, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Matt with Provider Trust. First, I want to say thanks so much for joining us today. And we are a little early. I'm going to give everybody about 3 more minutes to join. I just wanted to chime in here and make sure that you all can hear me well. So if you can just type in okay or something in the questions tab, that way I know you guys can hear me all right. And I will talk to you all soon. All right, everybody, welcome. It is noon here in Nashville, Tennessee, and we are very excited to get started. A little bit about, first, let me say a few things. The slides and a recording of this webinar will be shared with you all this afternoon. And also, we are happy and proud to say this is our first webinar that has been submitted to the Compliance Certification Board, and we are pending CEUs. So that process takes about 6 weeks, but once we receive that authorization, we will forward that to you all, and you'll all get 1 hour credit for your CEUs. So we're very happy to say that. Moving on, Mike and Donna, you guys that have been on a few of these, you recognize these faces. Some great people in the industry. They have a lot of information to share, and we are just as excited as ever for this webinar and the time and effort that they put into this, mostly Donna, to make this great. So thanks so much for joining, and I'll pass it over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Matt. So everyone, thank you for joining. We are excited today to actually talk about a topic that can sometimes be considered droll, but really is important. So we're going to spice it up and provide some very helpful, useful information for you to go back when looking at, is your compliance program and auditing of it really effective as far as the way the federal government looks at that. So we're Provider Trust, made here in Nashville, Tennessee. We started back in 2010, and great place to have a business. We consider Nashville, and I think so does the rest of the country, as sort of the healthcare capital. A lot of innovation here, and it's an exciting place to be in healthcare and technology. For those of you who are new to Provider Trust, thanks for finding us or accepting Matt's invitation. We hope you will be back for others. For those of you who know us or know of us, we're focused on the healthcare compliance through software as a service, focusing really on the day one and beyond of hire of someone. So they've already been background checked, and now we're helping your organization remain compliant with various state and federal requirements to monitor certain parts of their credentials. This is what we do every day, and we're committed and love doing so. So, some people think that an auditor is someone who tries to solve a problem you didn't know you had, and in a way that you probably don't understand. I like to look at auditors and auditing a little differently, and I think Donna would agree that that really the purpose of an audit is not to catch someone and to call someone out, but to make the organization better, to improve on the ways that the organization can become more compliant, and to address them. Nobody's perfect. The federal regulators are willing to acknowledge that, but they want to know that you're doing something about it. And so in this regard, what we hope today you'll get out of the webinar is understanding the importance of this function as it applies to auditing your compliance program and determining what would be considered effective to help your organization improve. So let's all, as we do always, start with a polling question. We're changing it up this time, not asking what industry you're in. We'd like to know what your initial reaction is when you hear the word audit. So there are a couple of choices up on the screen for you to pick. We really kind of want to get a feel for, when you first hear this word, you always hear the joke, I'm an auditor and I'm here to help. And that's, what does it mean to you, and what is the first reaction that you have? So I'm at about 5 more seconds. All right. So just so you know where you stand in comparison with others on this call, oh good, only 5% really have an initial reaction of fear, and that's good. We would have expected higher, but it seems like probably based on the titles of the people that have signed up that you're very seasoned at this. So stress, sure, and stress is normal. That doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's a lot of extra work. EA didn't expect that one to be as high, but we'll take the humor in that. And then, look, it's a necessary evil, which is where about half of you landed, and we would agree. To be in a regulated field like healthcare, it is a necessary evil. For those of you who need a vacation, I'm joining you, but with that, I'd like to turn it over to Donna, who really has spent most of her career in a compliance officer position and having been involved in many audits in the long-term care sector. Donna, take it away.
Well, thanks, Mike. Thanks, Matt. And welcome, everyone. Happy spring. Hopefully, some of you are in locations where you're actually enjoying the spring. I am in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I can tell you this morning, everything was frost covered and unfortunately a little bit brown. But we're hoping for spring, and I'm hoping you all are having a wonderful spring as well. So let's just move in and start talking about those audit considerations. So we did a webinar, I think in September of last year, kind of what we would consider the 101 on auditing and compliance. And so we didn't want to be redundant today, but we do want to make sure for those of you that didn't join us last fall, that we do talk about some of the basic important elements of a compliance audit program. But then we're going to deep dive a little bit into looking at our own compliance programs and those effectiveness. So I think it makes the most sense to always remind ourselves that within the 7 elements of a compliance program, one important component is, of course, conducting internal monitoring and auditing. So as we're looking at auditing, you're always reminding ourselves that it is a requirement, right, to make sure we have a good compliance program. So then how do we begin? Well, here's just some thoughts that we put together. Ask yourself some of these questions as you're beginning to think about how to build your audit program. So first, you might ask yourself, do we as an organization have an enterprise-wide audit program? And by that, I mean, do you know all the audits that are taking place? And is that information relatively transparent, meaning that we all know about the various audits that are taking place? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a couple seconds or a couple minutes. And then how are you determining what to audit? Are you identifying risk areas and that's driving your audit? Are you talking to folks? how are you really deciding what those important audits might be? And then if you know what your audits are and you know what your risks are they really aligned within your audits? So if you've identified a set of risks and you aren't auditing those particular risk areas, that might be an aha moment or an opportunity for you to add an audit or reconsider some of the other audits you're doing, making sure that you're really aligned with your high risk areas. So then presumably you're doing some audits, right? Are you monitoring your progress so that are you really identifying improvements in the metric that, the issue that you were monitoring? Because if you aren't, how are you going to improve your audit if you're not monitoring to make sure that your outcomes are changing? And then the last one is, are you monitoring the effectiveness of your own compliance program? And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So who's involved in this audit planning? Really, the easy answer is just about everybody, but certainly you would start with your leadership, right? Each of the different disciplines or departments, lines of business perhaps, all have their own unique set of risks. So certainly you'd be talking to those folks, identifying where the areas of concern or priority are for each of them. Maybe you have an internal audit department that has obviously a very specific audit plan. Certainly wanted to make sure that you know what's of most importance for that group. Your compliance committee, they're looking at metrics and seeing all sorts of information. So you'd certainly want to be asking those folks, what do they want to see in an audit plan for this particular year? Audit committees, some organizations have audit committees, some don't. Again, they would have a lot of opinions surrounding what your audit plan should look like. So certainly you'd want to be talking to that group as well. And your executive leadership, right? So as your organization is looking at potentially new initiatives for the organization or some metrics that are of utmost importance, you'd want to be hearing it from them and meeting with that group, making sure that everything you've learned from the other areas is consistent with the leadership perspective and goals for the upcoming year. So easily the answer is, of course, all of the above. So what are the considerations when you're building that audit plan? So one of the questions I would ask is your audit plan mostly or primarily focused on those high risk areas in your organization, or are they kind of across the board and metrics or audits that we've just done forever and we haven't really aligned with our primary risks? Are you auditing your compliance program and the 7 elements? Again, those are just kind of those the component that we're going to talk about in a little bit, so piquing your interest hopefully. Is your audit process effective? We just talked about in that last slide, are you monitoring the outcomes to make sure that your outcomes that you're looking for are improving? So you want to make sure that your audit process, it's not redundant, it's not causing unclear data, really making sure that the information that you're trying to glean from your audit, that you're actually able to get it. So is your audit process effective? And then when's the last time I updated my audit program? Am I really reevaluating it every year? Or am I kind of in a status quo mode where I'm auditing the same thing I audited last year because I've already built that audit and everybody knows how to do it and I know how to capture the data? Really ask yourself, how frequently am I updating my audit program? So how are you going to prioritize? We just talked about, are you auditing the most important high risk things? Are you just auditing everything? In my opinion, and I think most of you would agree, each year you kind of have to reprioritize your audits and you have to go back and look at a variety of things. Looking at your internal risk areas, right? We've talked about each different discipline or department, different group of folks having different risk areas. So making sure that we know what those are. If a new regulation came out last year, you might have a new risk area that wasn't part of your audit plan last year. So you need to make sure you're incorporating new internal risks. And I guess that leads me to the next one, external factors, right? Regulatory changes, enhanced government scrutiny. You see in the next bullet where it talks about that the OIG work plan is now updated monthly. So in the past, we know it was only updated on an annual basis. Now it's updated monthly. So our ability to hear from the OIG on those areas of scrutiny or those areas that they're really focusing or modifying their activities. We'll be able to get on a monthly basis, so that information would have certainly would be valuable as you're thinking about your audit process. Now, you might also consider a scoring. So depending on how you do your internal risk assessment, you might be capturing risk assessments across your organization and then talking to folks about the potential impact and likelihood of that risk, and creating a scoring grid so that just perhaps takes some of the bias out of the conversation of risk assessments and priorities, and allow a scoring mechanism to drive the higher priority risks. And then let's look at some of the history, right? Did we have any overpayments or recoupments in the past year, or whatever the time frame is that you're looking back, that would potentially cause us or want us to consider conducting an audit relative to those overpayments or recoupments? Did you do a root cause analysis? Do you know what's causing those overpayments or recoupments, such that you want to audit that process? Depending on your healthcare organization, you may have deficiencies or citations. In the post-acute world, we had surveys where surveyors came into our centers and there were deficiencies or citations. You might have JCO citations. So if you have third parties that are issuing different deficiencies or citations, what does that look like? Do you see a pattern across your organization, such that you might want to do a little bit of internal auditing so that you can limit those third-party citations? And then, of course, the last one, but certainly very important, is our own internal benchmarking. What are we looking at month after month or month over month in our compliance committee or on our executive dashboards, where we're seeing perhaps benchmarking that or metrics that aren't hitting our benchmarks and we're below where we want to be. So maybe we should be auditing to try to figure out what's causing us to not meet our goals and objectives for certain metrics. So this is a resource that we're going to talk about today as we do a little bit deeper dive on our own compliance program effectiveness. This is something that HCCA, the Healthcare Compliance Association, and the OIG collaborated on back in early 2017. A group of healthcare professionals from all different healthcare segments literally sat in a room with a whole lot of amazing OIG professionals, staff from the OIG. And I was lucky enough to be part of that roundtable experience. And I can tell you, it was a great day of learning and listening. And we were given some very specific questions to answer. And we just sat at different tables, moved around the room, and just brainstormed of risk areas within compliance. And then how would a compliance or, how would a healthcare organization measure whether or not their program themselves is effective? And it's based on the 7 elements of a compliance program. So it's very easy to read and to follow the organization. At the HCCA conference last March, Daniel Levinson, the Inspector General, presented this document and reminded all of us that it is a great resource, but it's not meant to be a checklist, and it's not something that the government's going to use to measure us against whatever their standards are, but something that they strongly encouraged all of us to do as we look at ourselves and whether or not our compliance programs are effective. So we're going to use that as our guide as we walk through how to audit our compliance program effectiveness. So let's talk about a variety of different audits. So I kind of thought this was funny. I'm not sure anybody else will think it's funny. My husband always says, try not to be funny, honey. You're really not that funny. But every once in a while, I attempt it. Mike Rosen is definitely significantly better at that. But this is the you name it audits, right? There's so many things that we audit within our organizations. You can pretty much audit anything that you want, right? We all have quality metrics or financial metrics. We look at our turnover and our employee satisfaction. We have to monitor and audit our reimbursement, right, to make sure that we're staying within the federal guidelines. We audit our documentation to make sure that we have good, solid clinical documentation to support the reimbursement. So there's all these different kinds of audits. And then if we move to the next slide, we want to ask you a little bit about your audit. And I think Mike or Matt, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to take this, but let's ask whether or not you at your organization have an enterprise-wide audit plan. And we'll give you, 15 or 20 seconds, whatever Matt thinks is best. And we'll see what's going on within your healthcare organization.
Yep, thanks, Donna. We are tracking the poll right here and trending towards 3, 2, 1, close it out. All right. Well, it looks like close to 2/3 do have an enterprise audit plan, which is great. Maybe 20% don't or are implementing one, and then about 12% are not sure, and that's fine. Worth checking out, because you'll see why there's a benefit to that in just a second.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. So enterprise-wide audit awareness, why is that so important? In my mind, it's really important because duplicating audits, or maybe you're duplicating certain elements of an audit, really causes frustration. It causes frustration by the auditee, the person that's being audited. It's like, wait a minute, how many people are going to ask me the same question, or how many times do I have to provide the same information? It also potentially causes confusion because I might not have exactly the same measurement in my audit as somebody else does. So if we're measuring the same element, but if we're auditing the same element but measuring it differently, it could cause different outcomes, and that's very confusing, and it's active actions, right? If there's duplicity or mixed messaging in our audits. So when you're thinking about that and asking yourself some questions to get your head around it, or to get more information, really ask yourself, do I have a central repository or a communication method that's everybody's aware of, so that we're not duplicating our audit processes? Do you really, even just to start, do you know what audits are being conducted across, is there a list? And as Mike said, it looked like almost 2/3 of you have an enterprise-wide audit. So you've already recognized the importance of this and the value of this. And really making sure that your audit outcome information is coordinated. So how are you centralizing the information when you're finished with your audits? I think, again, is really why enterprise-wide auditing is just so important to any organizations, especially those of us in healthcare. So the next slide just begins to help us start thinking about what a compliance program audit might look like. And again, I stole this completely from the Measuring Compliance resource guide. We're going to use all of their sections and their guidance, and then we're going to kind of hopefully bring it into real world for all of us. So these are more or less the 7 elements, a little bit paraphrased, but certainly looking at policy and procedure audits, hotline or compliance, administration compliance program, looking at exclusion monitoring, employee screening, the overall compliance program, and those of us as compliance officers, our effectiveness. How are we communicating or educating or training? What kind of disciplinary actions are we seeing across our organizations, and is that consistent with our policies? And then what do our investigations and look like, and are we even identifying process improvement based on all of the things that we're identifying in our audits and our investigations? So let's move into a little bit of the why.
Yep.
Mike,
Donna, let me point out something that you were just talking about with the compliance program audit, and how these effectiveness bullet points kind of dovetail the 7 elements. So it's important to note that the effectiveness guidelines are just that. They're not required. They're very voluminous. There's over I think that derived from sort of best practice from the people in the room. It is by no means, and the OIG makes it very clear, so let us reiterate that it's not required. You don't need to go in there, copy them, and think that you're plan needs to include all of them, but it does provide you with the best thinking currently amongst your peers across various facets of healthcare in how to address these 7 elements, if you will. So I just wanted to highlight that because these are the ones that I believe the OIG, obviously thinks are important because their work plan, the OIG work plan, as they're now uploading monthly, their guidance, and in fact this effectiveness guide all sort of zero in on. So make sure these 7 are in some fashion covered and audited to remain effective. So Donna said, why audit? Well, when it comes to the why, a lot of it's driven by not just best practice, but law, regulation, and in this case, we want to show you additional value that you gain by doing so. So it used to sort of be commonly said that you get, quote, credit just for having a compliance program. And initially to get, I think the intent was for the OIG to get everybody to jump up to the table and raise the bar. They vaguely referred to you're going to get some form of credit for having one. But I think what soon they discovered was what people did was they just copied them off of other stuff they found on the internet or a previous employment that the person came from, and they just brought over another unrelated from a different sector health plan, and so, or a compliance program plan, and so it wasn't really effective. And so no longer do you just get credit for having it, it really needs to be a living, breathing document that's updated. We're going to talk about that. Because the good news of having an audit or a program is that it is the guidelines, the map, if you will, of how your organization is agreeing to be held responsible and liable. The bad news is it is what your organization is agreeing to be held liable and responsible. So having just words on paper does not provide you with the comfort of an automatic credit. Now, considerations are given to an effective and established program, as we've laid out previous to this on some of the things that the guidelines would expect you to have. But really the additional value is it does make your organization better, and the OIG does want you to improve, recognizing that there are things you will uncover. But from a legal perspective, there are federal sentencing guidelines that apply when an organization finds itself in hot water in front of the Department of Justice, involved in a false claim, a Stark, or other violation. And these federal sentencing guidelines have been out for quite some time now. We thought we'd summarize 2 mitigating factors that are highlighted in the federal sentencing guidelines that decrease your score. So there is a mathematical equation or score that the federal judge, along with prosecutors and defense attorneys, will work from, but they have to work within them. The 2 that we thought you'd find important that do highlight what we're talking about today is the court is provided the ability and will subtract, in this case, 3 points from an organization's score if it has a, quote, effective compliance and ethics program. Now, see that they also added ethics to this. We're talking about compliance, but let it be known that ethics are equally important. And though this can be denied if it's unreasonably delaying reporting the offense to the authorities that was found. So again, having the plan is one thing, but doing something about it, and in some cases self-disclosing, is going to be an additional onus in order to get this reduction. So that is the second mitigating factor, which is self-reporting. And in addition to that, though, look at the italicized words, which we emphasize, that you actually have to fully cooperate, not just self-disclose and then close all the doors and hope that the investigators don't find something. And then you have to demonstrate your acceptance of responsibility. And this really is an interesting one because it's the most touchy-feely or emotional one, if any, among the federal sentencing guidelines, which are not really built around that. So you do get some credit if you step up to the plate, say, we own this, we're sorry, we're going to do the right thing, we're going to be better. Running and hiding is going to be a deduction from this score. So enough about the law. We do want to get back into and round out this second half of our webinar today on actually how is it best to audit your compliance program. So Donna, back to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. So just to bring us back kind of full circle, if we were getting started in thinking about auditing our own compliance program and trying to identify if we have an effective compliance program, these are the areas where we would start. And I'm not going to read them all. We just talked about them. Mike highlighted them again as well. So, but for purposes of in the slide, you'll have it if you want to look at it and refer to it in the future. So now what we're going to do, Matt, if you want to switch us to the next slide, perfect, is we're going to kind of break down some of these. And we're just going to talk about some of the what ifs. What if we considered these elements? And again, I took most of these bullets right from that resource guide. So as you go through that guide, you're going to see that in the right-hand column, there'll be the words audit or monitor or interview, things like that, that will absolutely help you, I think, spur on some thoughts of how that relates to your particular compliance programs. But I pulled out the ones that I thought were helpful and were kind of really resonated with me and my experience. So looking at policies and procedure audits, looking at the overall process, right? How do we consistently develop, review, and approve our policies and procedures? So do you have a process in place? Now, as you're thinking about this, one of the things that I struggled with is, well, how would I audit all of these things? And I won't say this 100 times, I'll try not to anyways, but think about some of these audits as full-blown audits where there's metrics that we're measuring. Some of these may be a consolidated checklist where I'm pulling 4 or 5 things from each section, from the policy section, from the compliance administration. You know, it might be a checklist, or it might be interviews, or it might be something that when a staff person is at a particular location, they're pulling some documents together. So kind of use that as your guide as we talk through some of these specifics. So look at, you know, do you include, oops, sorry, Matt, can you go back? Thank you. So as we continue to talk about the policies and the procedure audits, some other things that you would look at is whether or not the enforcement of policies is actually documented. Is it in your employee handbook? Is it in your code of conduct? You know, where are you telling folks that there is a responsibility to follow your policies and procedures? And, you know, do you ever interview your staff to make sure they understand the policies, or have you just written them and they're just out there and you leave it up to either someone to hopefully train on them or someone to read them? You know, are you really asking your folks or interviewing? Maybe you have some questions that you put together related to the most important policies that you would include in your audit. How do you implement new policies? Do you have sign-off? If you have a sign-off process where if a policy was edited or a new policy was put in place, that there's a designee or someone that has to sign off on the fact that they acknowledge the new policy. If that's the case, you could easily audit the percentage of how many times people are actually acknowledging the new policy. New hire orientation of policies, in my opinion, super important. Our new folks coming into our organization, it's oftentimes overwhelming, and we know in healthcare we have hundreds, if not thousands, of policies. So how are you helping your new hires orient to those policies, and what sort of processes in place that you might want to be monitoring? And then the last one I put on there, where I use the word hits, but if you have your policies and procedures in an electronic format, perhaps your IT folks have a methodology where they could help you identify by volume the number of times whatever policies that you think are important are clicked on or hit off your intranet site, perhaps. So that might be another easy thing to audit, to see if your important policies are being reviewed by your team. So screening and evaluation, I've broken this up into 2 slides. So the first one is really more of this, what I would consider screening probably, is the OIG, the SAM, the state exclusions, Social Security Death Master File, or OFAC, those sorts of things. You know, how are you screening them for your employees, your vendors, and then your non-employed, I guess it could say employee, but non-employed providers? It's really important. I think we know usually how, not easy, but the employees are the ones that we most often are comfortable monitoring. And then we get to our vendors or our non-employee providers, and it's really, it can be really difficult. So how are we doing that? And some of the specifics that I put in that next one is the volume of what we call false positives or potential matches. What I mean by that is, in your screening process, do you know, are whoever's monitoring that for you, if you have an individual in your organization, or do you have a third party that's doing that, you know, are they screening just exactly on the name of the employee that you have in your payroll file, or are they screening just current name? Do you have maiden names? You know, what does that look like, and what's the volume? Obviously, Mike said our core business model is managing this process. So we talk to clients all the time prior to coming to us who say, oh, we haven't had a match in 3 years. Oh, and we don't even have any fuzzy or, you know, potential matches. And as a compliance officer, I would say, oh my goodness, that really scares me, because we know that if you're just looking at the OIG data, it's, you know, without a social security number to start, there's all sorts of potential matches. So really, I think that's a good metric for you to look at. What's that quantity of potential matches that you're seeing? So you can really decide whether or not you're doing a quality screening process. And then, did you have any self-reports or repayments? You know, to me, that's just kind of a tracking in your audit. Maybe it's just a check mark as a yes, no, or a quantity. And then the next one is licensure verification. And this might be something that, depending on whether you're managing that at a location, or whether you're managing that through a third party, but just, you know, picking a random sampling of employees and making sure that the licensure verification was completed, or going out to the board yourself and spot checking to make sure that the license matches the actual name that you have in your payroll system, and that it doesn't have any sanctions and that sort of thing. Again, an important part, I believe, of screening and monitoring. And then the last one, in our contracts, we oftentimes put the burden of screening on our vendors, for example, of a staffing agency or something like that. So are you ever reaching out to your contractors and asking them to prove that they're doing screening and monitoring of the staff that are coming into your facility using that same staffing agency example? So let's look at perhaps the evaluation side of it. So when you're looking at new hire, you know, what's that new hire process? Do they have electronic files or paper files? If that's either one, you could, again, pick a random sampling of new hires and make sure that the license was verified, you know, pre-hire, that whatever criminal background checks were done, abuse registries were monitored, exclusion monitoring was completed, that they had references checked, all those pre-hire things. You could quickly have a checklist and do some random sampling of your new hire processes. Performance evaluations. As a matter of fact, just recently talking to a current client of ours, and they were sharing with us that they actually have performance evaluation, that whole performance management kind of process, as part of their bonus structure, because they've identified that it was a potential weakness in their organization, that folks weren't getting their performance evaluations as timely as they wanted. And obviously the staff was feeling frustrated by that. So making sure that your performance evaluations are being done timely. Again, there might be an easy sampling of that you could complete. And then exit interviews. If you're looking at the effectiveness of your compliance programs, is your compliance program gathering compliance concerns or potential issues through the exit interview process? So I think this was a really important area. And then conflict of interest or disclosure reporting. Again, I think that's just a random sampling that you'd be able to identify the volume, you know, the percentage of your employees that were supposed to complete a conflict of interest form and whether or not it was done. So
Right,
another Go ahead.
Yeah, we'll do one poll here before we kick into the last section and tie it all together. Have you guys audited your compliance program? Try to be honest. We're not tracking who's saying what or holding you responsible, but be honest with yourself. Are you really auditing your compliance program? And that would be simple yes or no, or you're not sure. And that's okay if you're not sure. All right, Matt, we'll close that out. So almost 2/3, yes. 30% maybe not fully or at all. And then those of you who need to go hunt and find out, be sure to be eyes open on this one because it's something that really you need to be doing. All right, Donna, let's talk about the administration of a compliance program.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. So this one I think is the hardest one because they're really asking us to almost evaluate ourselves to a certain extent, right? So this might be one where some of these components, you're either having a third party come in, you're having your internal audit director help you with this. Some of it you can do, some of it I don't think you can do as easily yourself and try to be unbiased. But, ask yourself questions about, if you're the compliance officer, what's your effectiveness? And some of the things, how involved is the compliance officer? Are they out of their office? Are they part of the leadership team? Are they part of the decisions related to growth in the organization? Are they looking at compensation packages, bonus programs? Are they looking at training and education? Just see, how involved they are. When you talk about interviewing folks, if you go to certain locations, do people know who the compliance officer is? Do they know that there's a hotline? Do they know where to find a phone number to call? All of those are really good metrics and ways to monitor whether or not kind of the compliance program is effective. Another maybe metric that you could monitor yourself would be the timeliness of issue communication and resolution, right? So theoretically, most of you, I would suspect, have some sort of a log. It could be paper, it could be electronic, it could be a third party, but you're logging compliance activities, issues, hotline calls, that sort of thing. So tracking the length of time it takes to close those, tracking whether or not certain calls are escalated. Can you see a pattern of escalation? So those, I think, are metrics that you can measure yourself, but this would be one where you probably are going to ask for some support or assistance in measuring from some other folks in your organization or even potentially outside of your organization. The next area we want to talk about is education, training, communication. In my previous role as the Chief Compliance Officer, one of the things that I was super excited about, and one of my passions is training. That's why I love doing these webinars. But we modified our process such that we put a compliance slide or message in all of our training. So as you're looking at your compliance program and effectiveness, really ask yourself, where does compliance fit into the training? Are you all tied in or is it not? Are you training on your high risk areas? So you can tie back to the audit program and your high risk areas and then measure the training based on those high risk areas. Certainly a metric would be looking at your completion records, right? How good are we at getting the training done when we say we're supposed to have it done? And measuring the feedback on the quality of the training. Now, you could turn a lot of these metrics back to specifically asking about compliance training and whether the compliance training is effective, whether it's training on high risk areas. So you can kind of decide, I think, on this particular area, whether you're talking about organizational training or whether you're just measuring compliance and its training. So when you look at the bullet, compliance messaging, does it stick? I think, when you're out in particular locations, depending on your type of organization, for me with nursing homes, when I was out in the facilities, we would always ask, do you know where your compliance poster is? What would you do if you had a concern? Ask about the code of conduct, ask if they've ever seen a newsletter, things like that. So just trying to see if the compliance message is really sticking, is it really out there? And again, how many clicks or hits, if you're sending out electronic communication related to the compliance program, how many people are actually opening the email or clicking on the link to a newsletter or something like that? Another easy way, I think, to audit whether or not people are taking advantage of the communication. And then on-site interviews, I don't think I've really said this enough, but in my humble opinion, interviewing and talking to people and really truly getting their feedback on all of these topics is one of the best ways for you to know whether or not your compliance program is effective. So I would always incorporate interviews. So the next slide, this one is kind of the be all end all, right? Monitoring, auditing, internal reporting. So on this particular webinar, right, we're talking all about audit plans. So this is one element of a compliance program, but certainly incorporates everything that we're talking about today. So you can, I think, consider this again in two fashions. One, very focused on compliance and looking at your hotline, at the scores of the training that you're putting out, really, your compliance committee metrics, and really, tracking and auditing baseline and scores and metrics, I think are kind of no-brainer sorts of things for this one. And then to look at it more globally, looking at your audit plan and how are you communicating your outcomes? Are the metrics improving? That's a big question. And if they are improving, then to me that shows some of the, hopefully, the effectiveness of the audit process. And determining whether or not the audit process is independent, right? How is it all, is it allowed to function independently? So I think these are, this is an area where we could talk forever and ever and ever, because I think there's so many, again, different things to audit. But when you're really looking at your compliance program and whether or not it's effective, try to boil it down to just some core elements that you think will give you the best view as to whether or not the audit process is effective, which is, helps make sure that your compliance program is effective. So let's move on to the next section, which is discipline. Now, to me, this is one that's pretty difficult, depending on kind of the transparency and the way information is tracked in your organization. So first, the big question, right, is whether or not discipline is consistently applied across your organization. So depending on the size of your organization, you might have just all sorts of different folks who are responsible for disciplinary actions and oversight. So of course, the more people that are touching that, the more difficult it is to have consistency. But I think we also know how important it is to have consistent discipline, because otherwise we know that that will result in all sorts of workforce issues when, Sally wasn't treated the same as Susie was when they did the same, had the same behaviors. So you might have the opportunity to review personnel files, pull a sampling of, again, depending on how information is tracked, if there's a tracking mechanism such that you can look at types of discipline or perhaps types of termination, and then you can go back and pull, random sampling of those personnel files to see if there's documentation that supports the disciplinary action consistently. Certainly, again, looking at interviews, asking folks how they feel about discipline and non-retaliation. There's an awful lot that you can learn from that fashion. And then this probably isn't exactly auditing, but something that I thought was important or helpful is that we put a lot of really good examples of appropriate and inappropriate behaviors in our code of conduct. And I think that is a good way to try to show and communicate what's expected related to our behavior, and then what the results are for failing to follow those policies and procedures and expectations. So the last one we want to cover is investigations. There we go, investigations and remedial measures. And this one, again, I think you could go down a lot of different paths. But when you're really looking at, the timeliness of the investigation, the documentation completeness, I think you can have checklists that for each investigation, most of you probably already have some sort of a checklist or a process that you follow. And you could just post some random samplings to see how well we followed our own investigation methodology and the timeliness of that. Were they tracked? Are they in your log? Or again, if you have a third party or however you're tracking investigations, are you seeing that every open investigation is closed, that it has been properly tracked? Is it being escalated to the board, or is it being reported to the compliance committee? Is it going to leadership? How I think you can easily monitor the effectiveness of that process. And then the last, overpayment or self-disclosure. I think that's more of a pretty easy, checklist. How many have we seen? Is it increasing? Is it not? That sort of thing. And then the last one, corrective action completion or effectiveness. I think that kind of goes back to the overall metrics. So when we're talking about remedial measures or activities, if we audited something and we identified, a pattern of non-compliance or a failure to meet our benchmarks, and then we implemented corrective actions, and then we monitored or audited again, are they improving? So I think that's a pretty consistent one that most of us do probably on a very, very consistent basis. So that kind of wraps up our quasi deep dive into measuring the effectiveness of a compliance program. And we want to wrap up kind of going back to kind of general overall audit processes and talking about then tracking and monitoring our improvement. So I think it's important to communicate throughout the audit process, right? So we talked about who do we talk to at the beginning, how do we decide what audits to what are the areas we need to audit. So we started out communicating, and we need to make sure that throughout that audit and then immediately upon completion that we're continuing to communicate, right? So if we see something negative, the worst thing that could happen is if we don't tell anybody. So making sure that we are consistently sharing and communicating our metrics and our outcomes with leadership, with your board, with your various committees, and certainly the folks that you are auditing is, in my opinion, very, very important. Another thing that you need to think about as you continue your process is, you can go to the next slide, Matt. Thank you. Is evaluating your audit results, right? So does it make sense? What you just saw, is this the outcome that you expected? If you identified a core issue, right, that you're auditing, did you answer the question that you were hoping to? So really making sure that, I'm not saying that the outcome is what you want, but does it make sense based on the questions that you asked? Is the data or the outcome making sense? And then did I miss anything? Because if it's not making sense, or the data doesn't seem complete, or I don't have quite enough information, maybe I missed something in my audit process. And so then I need to go back and refine my audit, and then I may or may not need to do it again for the same source, but using a new process going forward is always important. And then really asking myself, what's the best way to present the outcome? So we were just talking about the importance of communication. So how am I going to communicate? How am I going to share those outcomes so that the message that we gathered is clear and concise, and people can understand next steps based on our audit results? And then the last thing we want to talk about today is really taking action, right? You did all this work, so you really want to make sure that you're getting the credit for it. And I think all of us know that if it isn't documented, it didn't happen, right? That's the old adage, certainly in healthcare. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. So make sure that you're documenting your audit results, your whole audit process, the audit results. Make sure you're documenting your corrective actions, whether we're talking about our general audits or whether we're talking about our own compliance program effectiveness. What the government tells us over and over and over is they don't expect perfection, but they do expect self-identification and improvement. So by documenting corrective actions, we know that we're going to get credit for the great things that we've been doing. Make sure that if you're improving or changing your audit, that you're documenting those changes as well. And as I just said, take credit for the progress that you're making. Make sure that you're reporting to your board and your different committees, making sure that you're showing people, here's where we started with our benchmarks, here's what we identified, here's the corrective action, and here's where we are today. It's a really great story, so you want to make sure that you're sharing that. And then I think you'll do, if we're following all of these actions, I think you really will have an effective compliance program, and you want to make sure that you're not just auditing everybody else, but you're auditing yourself too, so that you can be confident that you have an effective compliance program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to wrap us up.
Thanks, Donna. So we always like to end with, if you learn nothing else, hopefully these things came through. Auditing impacts your entire organization. And in fact, Patrick, who's participating today, actually sent a very nice comment indicating, and I agree, that auditing should take a collaborative approach, that working positively with various department representatives rather than police and catch the culprit approach goes a long way and makes the organizations better. So taking a consultative and discovery approach, as Patrick suggests, is what he's found very beneficial in his organization. And we would totally agree. it not only impacts the organization from a standpoint of time, but it actually impacts the organization by making it better. So really, that combined with tracking your outcomes, communicating and updating when you find areas to improve, that's the name of the game. If you do that, you'll be a best of breed and doing what is considered effective. What I'd like to do is ask if anyone has any questions in the remaining 2 minutes we have today. Please type them into the question box so we can be sure to address them. And as we're getting a few in here, the first one is, Donna, what is the best way to and where to store the audit results so that they can be dealt with, but also confidential?
Oh, I have to unmute myself before I can answer. Sorry about that. Well, I think it really depends on what kind of audit outcomes you're talking about and who needs to see that information. So certainly if these are compliance audits, they would stay within the compliance organization. If you have some really sensitive information and metrics, I'd be working with my general counsel, my legal, to identify which metrics or the volume of information that's being shared. Our general rule is that your initial information that you're providing is consolidated, rolled up, if you will, so that you're providing a big picture, not the details of the audit itself. So if you're auditing, certain types of records that would have employee names on them, or if you're auditing, clinical outcomes, that sort of thing, that has patient information, you certainly wouldn't want the audit results or the audit information shared at all. You'd only want that roll-up information shared. So certainly within either the audit department, the compliance department, the legal department, and again, in my organization, we had a very too many layers probably, but had very high level security around certain electronic folders that only 1 or 2 people could have access to. I hope that makes sense.
Okay. All right, thank you, Donna. That's very helpful. Well, in the interest of time, we have a few others which we'll be able to respond to you directly, but we do want to thank you for attending the sessions today. We encourage you to visit our site. We've got several ebooks that we hope are very helpful. Most recently, the licensing ebook that we've released. We are prolific bloggers and proud of it and hope you find them helpful. So please find us there. Follow us on social media. And we have webinars each month, this being the one for, what month are we in, March?
Yes.
March. And the next 2 have been posted on the website, although each month for the rest of the year we'll do at least one. So feel free to do that. Remember that we expect to be receiving CEU approval shortly, and we'll notify you so that you can get a certificate from us and get the credit. And then on an ongoing basis, we'll be submitting these well in advance so that we can get them approved, as we hope this one will be. So with that, Donna, thank you as always for your great insight, and we hope that you found our session very helpful and that we'll hear or see you at a future event. Please visit us next month at the HCCA conference. We have a very large booth and some fun treats. For those of you who know us, you know what I'm talking about. Otherwise, come see what they are and get a chance to meet the people that make Provider Trust a great place to work. Thank you so much for your time today. Happy Passover or Easter.